Hi, I'm James. Welcome to Homegrown. On this week's episode, we've teamed up with the South Dakota Stockgrowers Association and the Natural Resources Conservation Service to bring you a show all about our amazing resource, the soil. We're going to talk about the 5 soil health principles and how implementing different practices on ranches help make those ranches more productive, more profitable, and more economically sustainable.
I was an ag teacher for 25 years and then did a 10-year gig with SDSU Extension as a sheep field specialist, but I've always ranched during that time, and we operate kind of southeast of Newell and northeast of Vail on the edge of the irrigation project. So in my retirement from that, I have a part-time contract with the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition to help producers out in western South Dakota understand the concepts of soil health.
So retired, but still educating.
Still got to work for a living, yeah. This field has not been tilled since 2000 was the last time I ever
So over 20 years that this has been.
Never had iron in it. My reason for moving to no-till was a time factor. It wasn't necessarily about it was going to create more production or less production. I just had limited amount of time as a teacher to be out here making passes in the land, and interestingly enough, it works, and it has a really impactful response on marginal soils going into soil health. So as I went down that journey, this is a flat terrace up here, and water, when I irrigated it, when I tilled, I could do this field in about 2 weeks. And as I moved to no-till and got more years into it, it took longer for the water to get across this field. So what that was telling me is I wasn't sheeting it off, and the soils, these are heavy clay soils, class 4 land. Soil depth is about 3 feet before you hit a shale seam. So, you know, you're sealing up the soil, you're getting a little bit of infiltration, and then within a couple of weeks, your soils are starting to crack as the gumbo gets these big old cracks in them. And then you're out of water again, you're irrigating. And so the cool thing is, as you went into soil health, you had a longer span between irrigations. Which again, another time savings, but also added to productivity. This climate out here is harsh. We have a low annual rainfall, about average of 15 inches here. Certainly in 2019, we had much less than that, probably less than 11. And so looking, that's a desert climate, and or in 21, and then in 19 we had record rainfalls of 25 inches. So a land of extremes, and if your soils aren't healthy, they cannot respond to that. Taking in too much water or not having enough to get by. So the economics that comes out of it, it's all about holding water.
When your soils are more healthy, what you're saying is that creates a buffer zone between the highs and the lows. You might not get the greatest returns ever when you get 20 inches of rain, but when you get 5 inches of rain, you're still going to be producing something.
You start getting predictable outcomes, which I like, my banker likes that, and you start being able to manage things, and rather than this boom or bust cycle we seem to get in with because we can't control the weather.
You know, we're standing here where you've cut some alfalfa. After that, we had some pretty nasty weather, some rain, hail, wind, and a lot of things. And we can take a look at, you know, where there's a spot where it wasn't cut. There's a windrow here. Let's stick a shovel in the ground and see what we find out.
You can see with pushing that shovel in, we've got some resistance, and then when we bring this up, we've got some compaction in the top, you know, that the rain caused. The good thing about this is that this soil is resilient, and it will expand back out because of the organic matter that's involved. The other thing we're going to find is if you do look at the underside, there's still macropores in there from the earthworms, but we're not finding any earthworms. And that's kind of telling on bare ground. So if we move over here,
and that's Ben, that's been laid down for what, 5 days now?
Yep,
4 or 5 days?
Look at the surface. You see insects
and you
moving.
can just see the difference in the surface area between this, which
right
is
now
dried out and cracked, and this is just, I mean, you can just touch it.
Yeah.
And feel this is warm and dry, and this is moist and cool.
Yep.
I mean, you can see the difference.
So then look at how that shovel goes in.
Yep.
There's no resistance. And then look at our friends. We just moved 3 feet.
You break this, it's still just.
Yep. It's.
I mean, this is a mud ball that if you hit somebody with, it's going to hurt.
These are heavy clay soils. This should never have been put under. Farming practices. This should have stayed prairie. But because we have an irrigation project and we have an investment in this, we need to look at some returns.
Right.
But isn't it interesting? No worms there. One little shovelful, and look at the size of those guys.
Yeah.
It's.
So let's look at this area right behind us too that hasn't been cut.
This would kind of represent the prairie with growing grasses. But look, you've got residue that's cycling back. You've got green growing plants, and there goes a spider, which that's exactly what you want. You want life there. That goal that you ever want is you never want a raindrop to hit bare ground.
Sure.
It should always hit residue, or it should hit a plant, and then it should just go in.
Right.
You know, compared to eastern South Dakota where they raise grain and everything they grow, they combine.
Right.
In western South Dakota, anything, it doesn't matter, cereal, grain, or corn, we put it in a bag or we put it in a bale.
Right.
It all gets removed from the land. Well, we're mining those minerals.
Right, you're taking all that organic matter, minerals, everything else, and harvesting it here and feeding it somewhere else, usually.
Yeah, and then the question is, do we put it back?
Right. So when you come in with another crop, you're going to start putting a lot of that back.
Put it back.
Because you've taken it off here for a few years with this alfalfa.
And the other thing I do when I am in an annual situation with those crops, we feed back out here.
Oh, so you're going to take livestock and integrate them back
in the wintertime.
Sure.
Those cattle never see a corral other than when we ship.
Awesome.
They live out here. We've got windbreaks. You can see them up there.
Yep.
And those windbreaks have water tanks, and those all lead to different fields that we can feed on.
Talk about soil classes sometimes, and you say this is a marginal class 4 kind of clayey soil. What is that class? What is that? Can you explain that to people that just don't know what soils, how we classify those?
Sure. The Soil Conservation Service developed those way back during the Dust Bowl to start looking at what soils should be used for cropland and which ones should be put primarily back to prairie. And so what they look at is what you were talking about, those physical properties of the soil that they possess that allow for its most productive use, its greatest potential. And we know that flat soils that have little runoff, that have a very good soil to plant to water relationship, which we would know as a loamy or a silty type soil that's deep, those are going to be our most productive soils. Year in and year out, don't need to know much. You put the seed in the ground and
it's just good stuff.
Does its magic.
Right.
Yeah. And then so that's your best, your class 1.
Okay.
And then your farmland is class 1 through 4.
Okay.
And there's what we call limiting factors, or those things that impact its productive potential. And so those physical properties would include the texture of the soil.
Right.
And as we referred to clay soils, those are soil particles that are so tightly bound together and so small that they eliminate all the air pores or spaces to hold air or water.
Right.
And then you have the complete opposite side, which is the sands, which is playground sand or very fine sand, which is does the other thing. It doesn't hold anything.
Right.
It's all full of air and
Right.
dries out fast. Water goes through. And so the one just right in the middle, that particle is silt. It has that best relationship. It lets enough air and water through, but it holds it long enough that the plant has a chance to get it. It's loose enough that the plant's roots can work its way through there. It doesn't have to fight, or it doesn't dry out. Great anchorage, so it's ideal. So those soils we don't find here.
Right.
The clay soils are challenging. Slope is another one. Flat land, water doesn't run off.
Right.
You get anything greater than 6% slope, which doesn't seem like much, but it's enough that, especially if you're doing tilling practices, as soon as that rain droplet hits that soil, you have a physical property of compaction occurring.
Right.
You're just compacting that soil, pounding those particles together, sealing off that surface, and then the water sheets off.
Right.
So you've just limited your infiltration and any use there. Soil depth, a lot of these soils, like we referred to, are from an ancient seabed that are shale based, and it's just even down to 18 inches, 2 feet, and then you've hit shale.
Wow.
Well, there's no soil depth for plant roots to work through, and that's where the perennials help.
Right.
Annuals just aren't going to have enough room to get anything done in a year. So we classify them. The first thing they look at is what's your annual rainfall. And so in eastern South Dakota, you can have Class 1 lands. Central South Dakota, your best soil capability is Class 2 because you're starting to lose rainfall. Right. Western South Dakota, everything, it could be silty soil, flat ground, deep soil. We're missing one thing: water.
It's kind of an important thing.
Yeah. So that's where the irrigation.
So your best soils in western South Dakota
will never reach their productive potential because they're limited by the rainfall.
Right.
So the best we can have is a 3. How do we solve that rainfall deal? We irrigate.
Right.
So that replacement can do some great production, and it does.
Yeah.
We still have an extreme in our range in temperatures that eastern South Dakota doesn't have. That impacts production. But then as you go along, so Class 4 can have all these. It only needs one physical property to be a Class 4 that's severe enough, like slope. But many times Class 4 soils have more than one limiting factor. We've already got the rainfall one.
Right.
We put some slope to it, we've got that issue. If we've got a shallow depth and hitting a shale layer, we've just hit another one.
Right.
So what you run into is all these things against it, but they still call it a Class 4, which is very misleading.
Right.
And that's, you go down that whole that whole rabbit hole regarding property tax valuation, and that's what they're fighting against. That's the struggle. You can have one piece of ground that's Class 4 that's only got one limiting factor, and you have one piece of ground that's Class 4 that's got a whole bunch.
Right. And they're still taxed the same.
They're still taxed the same. And it just, no. And it's, I just feel for those assessors because they didn't go to school for that.
Right. Yeah.
And then you've got Class 5 is what they identify as wetlands, where you're ponding your water. And wetlands are great, and we should identify them as such and let them be wetlands. And you can graze wetlands. You can utilize them that way. You just got to be careful because that's our, that's nature's filtration system right there. And we really need to watch those wetlands. Something we probably haven't talked enough about. And then 6 and 7 should just be managed as pasture because they just have too many limiting things to them. Most times it's slope or it's soil depth, but then in northeast South Dakota it's rockiness or stoniness.
Right.
And then Class 8, that's badlands. There's no topsoil. There's
everything else.
There's not a flat spot. There's just, and it's beautiful. So you just use them as recreation.
One of the other huge soil health principles is integrating livestock, and you do that in a sort of a unique fashion, as you can see behind us. So tell us about how you integrate livestock on your rangelands.
Certainly. Well, I don't know about unique because it was the way I was brought up. You have two species of animals that have preferences both in topography and in diet.
Sure.
And so we're not only are we trying to establish diversity in the plant life, but diversity in the livestock on top of the ground.
Right.
Makes a difference in how things work. And
Right.
if we think about soil health and trying to mimic the native rangeland, well, we think about the animals that were on
Right.
the native rangeland before we got here. And obviously the buffalo was your big herbivore.
Right.
And consumed lots of grass. And we know that our native rangelands are somewhere around 80% grass. And then you have your broadleaf, both not herbaceous and woody plants that the deer and the antelope followed along the edges of the buffalo migration.
And elk, right?
And elk
Yeah.
out here too.
Yeah.
A lot of things that cattle don't care for, at least you're keeping them in balance by having another species use
Sure.
that. But you're also stacking and running more pounds of animal per acre
Right.
on the same amount of acres. And we're always challenged with that return per acre. And here we're able to stack an enterprise,
Right.
another one on top of the cattle.
What are the hurdles? Why don't more people stack that enterprise on there? It doesn't seem like they're taking anything away from the cattle, but there's got to be reasons, and can you address some of those concerns for people?
Certainly, yeah. It's kind of funny. What was old is new again, and we're seeing a better sheep market now, so there's interest that way too.
Right.
And the other thing is, a lot of ranches are trying to figure out how to bring the next generation
Sure.
home, and they're trying to figure out what enterprises to bring in. And guess what? At one time, they probably had sheep on that
Right.
place, and that the old rule was one cow could handle one sheep behind her for the reasons we talked about. They're not competing for the food source.
Right.
And so if you had 300 cows on your ranch, you can run 300 sheep. Usually the wife and kids took care of them in a lot of cases,
Right.
and that provided family living and sources of income for them for school clothes and whatever. In recent years, we've had some very good support, both stock growers being one of them, sheep growers, even hunting interests in managing predators, because they prey not only on wildlife, but they get our domestic livestock, and
Right.
especially sheep. So in this case, we run llamas and donkeys.
Okay.
And it tends to work in where our location is. We're not in big open prairies like a lot of the range sheep producers. And in those cases, they'll use dogs and do
Right.
a lot of roaming.
Right.
We're more confined, and especially with our intensive grazing and having cattle and sheep together, guess what? Mama cow doesn't care for a coyote.
Right.
And she'll help keep
Right.
them out of these if you can keep those
You
two
can
species
keep 'em close
tightly
enough together.
We can train these sheep within
Yeah.
a week to eat specific plants,
Right.
like weeds, like Dalmatian toadflax was a project we did.
Yeah.
Within a week, they ate everything except the toadflax.
Right.
And then they finally had to eat it. And then as we got
Right.
within 2 weeks,
We're
when
getting a good response.
when we allotted them to a new pasture, then they would select out that toadflax first.
Right.
And you could move them out before they hit the other plants.
I think that's amazing.
It's
It's
just-
something we've studied. Well, hi there. It's something we've studied a little bit is wild critters here.
Yeah.
The fact that, what these animals eat, their diet is a learned behavior.
Yes.
Usually from their moms or their herd mates. And a lot of times, they've been out on a monoculture, they know crested wheatgrass, that's what they're going to go to. But if we can teach them, and we can teach them, if we're the smart ones in the room, the adults in the room, you can teach cows to eat Canada thistle, you can teach them to eat other noxious weeds, because if they're just grazing the good stuff, they're given the competitive advantage in that plant community to all the things that aren't as desirable.
they can
but we
compete.
can teach them to
Well,
attack those
think
as well.
about that. It's such a no-brainer. So we teach them to eat something we don't want, We turned that into red meat, which is profit for us. Plus, we didn't have to use a chemical, which some would argue is harmful.
Profitable.
It's a profit taker because you've got to put that out there plus the time, and some of those can be potentially harmful to the environment. So why aren't we doing that?
Yeah.
And it's going to come. It's going to have to come. We don't have those choices.
Right.
So something, in regards to those city cousins, they can play the same role in soil health that a rancher can.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you've got a lawn and a garden, you think about how many acres of lawn, or let's say green spaces, are in a city. So let's count parks, let's count golf courses, let's count our lawns. How many acres? And what do we do on those acres? We fertilize them.
Yep.
And do we do
fertilize
a little?
and water a whole bunch.
And we water a lot. And those grasses we're using, we're overgrazing them. We're cutting them too short.
Right.
We're taking the solar panel off.
Right.
And we're having those plants have to recreate themselves from fertilizer because they're not capturing the carbon from the sun because we're overgrazing.
It's not a real sustainable system because you're just continually adding inputs into those
Move
lawns.
your mower deck up one notch.
Yeah.
Leave some leaf. That leaf will be your solar panel to collect that sunlight, put that carbon back to the ground. You don't need nitrogen.
Right.
You're not getting that into your waterways.
Right.
And
just water
then you're
usage.
capturing carbon on your lawn.
Just water usage, it's not as big of a problem here because we just don't have that population. But if you move to, the Front Range in Colorado and all across the West, that water usage is a huge thing. And what do? We put a cool season grass down in everybody's yard, usually Kentucky bluegrass or something, which in the heat of the summer is really inefficient at keeping that water. So why don't we choose a better species like buffalo grass or something like that that's as good a turf grass but uses a fraction of the water? And I think that, we can help those urban people understand that as well.
Taylor rides just as well as any man.